So let's talk Cadians and Catachans, Vostroyans and Tallarn, with an overview of some of the most notable guard regiments in Warhammer 40k, and some of the pros, cons and interesting things about putting them on the table. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Astra Militarum, and in this video I thought we'd go through the various different regiments and talk about each of them in terms of their lore, miniature support and gameplay, talking through their iconic units and detachment rules that might be relevant. In Warhammer 40k, regiments of the Astra Militarum or Imperial Guard have always tended to work a little bit differently compared with other sub-factions out there, rather than just having different paint schemes for the same models or the same miniatures with maybe a few iconic units or aesthetic trinkets put on top. The Guard instead generally have had entirely different miniatures to represent the vast amount of different takes on regular humans with lasguns serving the Emperor, each with their own big variants in war gear and fighting styles, depending on where they might hail on from around the galaxy. Model-wise, that means that's maybe more kits to support than a Games Workshop would otherwise have, and while we used to have a whole bunch of regiments in metal, now from Games Workshop themselves we only really have the Cadian Shock Troops, Death Corps of Krieg, and the Catachan Jungle Fighters. I've certainly seen loads of people enjoy the lore for the other regiments and make them work on the tabletop, either through conversions, hunting down classic models on eBay, or proxy models from 3D printing or third-party creators. In-game at the moment, their gameplay works a bit different to a lot of armies in 40k now. In 10th edition, sub-factions are realised by detachments more or less, though the Astra Militarum basically have their own datasheets for things like certain Death Corps of Krieg units, Cadian Shock Troops and Catachan Jungle Fighters, kind of similar-ish units with their own special rules and fighting styles, and you can feel them all mixed together if you want to in a great big combined regiment, which certainly has some precedent in 40k lore. Depleted regiments might be drafted alongside each other to fight for the Imperial cause on some distant battlefield. I feel like some people like to go down this mixed regiment style approach, though a lot of people like to basically field one regiment and then basically have the aesthetic look of that regiment represent the various different units that you can field on the board. So you could have a force that's stylistically all Cadians but just uses the rules for, say, the Death Corps of Krieg datasheets or the artillery teams and things. In this video though, I thought we'd just talk through each of the major regiments of the Astra Militarum, where they hail from and how they tend to fight in the lore, any model support they have at the moment and a few examples from their past, and if you wanted to put a force of them on the tabletop, what detachment might be a lore-friendly one to field for them, and how strong are their unique or favoured units in-game. Jumping straight into it, and let's start out with the Cadian Shock Troops, pretty well the most ubiquitous and best known of the Astra Militarum, and have generally been the best supported regiment from Games Workshop for a very long time. These guys are just some of the finest examples of mortal soldiers for the Hammer of the Emperor, originally hailing from the now fallen fortress world of Cadian, where they were an entirely militarised society, entirely given over to repelling the enemies of the Emperor. From birth to death, every single person on the planet essentially serving in the military, constantly training and improving themselves for the day when they need to fight against the horrors that spew out of the Eye of Terror. Cadian, of course, was riven asunder in Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, though it took an entire Blackstone fortress to do so, and as a result the Cadians had to leave their homeworld, only returning there in times of pilgrimage. As much as people seem to think that they're essentially finished as a force, that really doesn't seem to be the case. They've instead settled on a whole number of nearby worlds, rechristening one of them to be New Cadian, and basically continuing their martial discipline lifestyle as they had before. In battle, they're basically just well-rounded exemplars of the Astra Militarum, commanding all their assets as is needed for the task. Big squadrons of tanks, massive batteries of artillery, and they're famed for their strategic thinking and their fire discipline, many a traitor falling to the entrenched positions of the Cadians and their merciless volleys of heavy weapons and lasfire. They're generally very practical, capable, and fully willing to give their lives for the Emperor when needed, and might be distinguished from other Imperial citizens by their purple eyes that reflect the glow of the Eye of Terror above. In the past, Games Workshops often made lore that they're the standard template guard regiment, with all sorts of other ones around the galaxy aping them and copying their gear. That might have been part of an in-universe explanation for why they had quite so many plastic kits of those, an extra incentive for guard players to use them. Talking of their plastic range though, they're one of the most vocal ones along with Krieg now. Their standard Cadian shock troops maybe having a bit of a 20th century military kind of vibe for them, domed helmets and a powerful rifle appearance, and maybe a little bit on the generic side, not really hailing from one culture or place. They can be a good canvas to add all sorts of personality on if you'd like to. They've got a whole bunch of other Cadian kits. The field ordnance batteries are generally fairly Cadian in theming. They've got their fighting elite in the Catachan, veteran Cadian warriors equipped with hotshot lasguns and all manner of special weapons. They're tough to take down in their carapace armour as well, and a few characters including the Cadian Castellan, an officer to command the troops, and Ursula Creed taking up the mantle in her father's footsteps as Lord Castellan of the surviving Cadians. The big three guard regiments that are realised in plastic also have command squads and heavy weapon squads. Their model range in general was pretty nicely redone towards the end of 9th edition, so it's really quite recent by 40k standards. They had a lot of old kits up to that point. And they also have a Cadian upgrade sprue as well with a tank commander on it, which could maybe step in for Knight Commander Pask if you'd like. Creed and Kell on the right here are no longer on sale, but I'm sure will continue to be well known in 40k history. Technically it sounds like Trazen the Infinite abducted Creed, so it's not impossible that he could return at some stage. Gameplay wise, I feel like you could justify most of the regiments for the Cadian shock troops if you wanted to. In general though, it does feel like the Combined Arms Regiment is the one that best exemplifies them. It combines extra lethal firepower with a whole load of orders, and that does seem to be what Cadians are all about: gunnery and clever battle strategy. With a whole bunch of lethal hits, the reinforcement stratagem, and fields of fire for a bit of extra AP, it's generally considered one of the stronger ones, so no reason not to use this one if you'd like to. For more lore-friendly units, aside from their actual unique stuff, they may be slightly unusually known for using autocannons and grenade launchers, and might have some white shield conscripts as well. In general though, they can be very flexible, and certainly have infantry, tank and siege regiments. And on the tabletop, most of their unique units tend to be really quite strong in game. Creed's pretty excellent at the moment, with 3 stratagems nearby and being the most efficient source of orders in the book. Lots of competitive lists include her. The Cadian Castellans may be a bit more niche, could be alright in a 20 strong guard squad. To lay down some heavy firepower though, if you want to build around infantry. The command squad's pretty great, able to broadcast orders around the board, could pair with Ursula Creed or Lord Solar Leontus to do that with a Master Box. The Cadian shock troops appear in the vast majority of competitive guard army lists, having sticky objectives is pretty nice, and comboing with Creed. The heavy weapon teams may be a bit more niche. I feel like perhaps the Catachan ones have the better special rule there. The Cadian Catachan are again absolutely top tier for the guard at the moment, often getting where they need to be in Tauroxes and then having nice boosted damage in combined arms, and their Tauroxes can go really far in Hammer of the Emperor. They've got good damage output and the ability to self-order when they jump out of transports now, and their field ordnance batteries are pretty nice indirect fire support. Games Workshop do have an unfortunate habit of pricing them for the bombast field guns though, so the other two have often been underpowered. In general though, if you want a well-rounded regiment that's an exemplar of the guard, the Cadian shock troops could be the one for you. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Warhaus. They're a fairly new gaming store in Australia, wanting to spread the word that they exist. They're having their grand store opening on April the 19th. They've certainly been busy on the last few months with online sales though, and are already pretty well established in that regard. If you live in Australia, their web store's linked below. They've got a massive 23% off Games Workshop prices, which is one of the best discount rates in the world for Warhammer. Certainly needed with Australia prices though, and they have plenty of the normal offerings of discount retailers. You can back order things if they're not in stock. They've got free shipping at over $150, and they've got a usual reward scheme loyalty system with their war points. As mentioned, they're just about to have the grand opening of their store on the 19th of April. They're based in Corinda outside Brisbane. They've got a pretty massive stock of 40k stuff, some of which you can see here, and have a couple of gaming tables if you want to drop in. To drum up a bit more interest for them, they've got some monthly giveaways as well. The April one will be for a Combat Patrol or Spearhead one, and I'll link the Instagram post down in the video description as well. But in any case, feel free to check them out if you're in Australia and you'd like some Warhammer 40k or other hobby supplies at a discount. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. On with the Astra Militarum though, and next up we have the Catachan Jungle Fighters, who are basically an army of muscle-bound space Rambos, hailing from their jungle death world of Catachan, where literally every bit of fauna and flora is out to kill and eat you, to the point where it basically guarantees that only both the strong, smart and fast can actually survive there, and they often like to comment that basically any given military engagement is going to be a walk in the park compared with surviving a day on their homeworld, with other regiments seeing them as rather gung-ho and fully ready to commit fully to a dangerous mission, do or die, without worrying about the consequences. In battle, they're perhaps particularly famed for their close quarters prowess, often supplementing their standard las guns with great big jungle machetes, and their stacked muscly physiques have occasionally caused other regiments to refer to them as baby ogrins, though only out of earshot of course. In war they tend to be practical and focus on the things that are important. Officers will generally lead from the front, inspire their forces to acts of valour, and very much act as one of the men as opposed to lording it above them. They care little for medals and trinkets, often dulling regimental badges if it helps them blend in with their environments better, and set more store by battle scars and tattoos, and their tanks tend to have improvised camouflage and unorthodox kill markings to celebrate in their victories. Miniature-wise, the Catachans do have a plastic range. There's certainly one that could really do with an update, and to be honest that's kind of been the case for decades. I feel like the original Jungle Fighters kit definitely gets the whole muscle-bound Rambo sort of thing across, and you'd be able to see that from a distance, but maybe to slightly cartoony proportions. They definitely do have some fun factor though with their machetes and the jungle plants and things that they have on their heavy weapon teams. The other things that Games Workshop have released for them, I feel still have the same fun factor, but just executed far better. The most recent Catachan kit is Guardsman Marbo himself, fighting like a shadow and the subject of many memes, slinking from cover to cover with his Ripper pistol and envenomed blade. And then in the foreground here you can see a couple of other Catachan limited edition miniatures that they came out with, a sergeant and a colonel that both have loads of character and some cool Catachan jungle scenery, really showing what they could do if they decided to give them a range update. Unfortunately, Gunnery Sergeant Harker and Iron Hand Strachan, who's killed just about every monster on this side of the galaxy, both of those have been sent to Legends and their models removed for the time being. I feel like if they do an updated Catachan release though, there's a pretty good chance that they'd return. Compared with the Cadians, I feel like their detachment choice to represent them is maybe a little bit less clear. Maybe could be a more obvious one for Games Workshop to go for a more overtly Catachan themed army as a detachment add-in for the Guard. Maybe the recon element one could be one of the better ones. Infantry focused and diversionary tactics, and lots of tricksy ways for their formations to survive against the enemy, whether it's at range or in melee. In general though, being quite over-dependent on the platoon-style units maybe is a bit of a weakness though. That's not really considered one of the stronger Guard regiments. In the past, when the Guard had specific regiment rules, they tended to be better in melee for their infantry units, and blast weapons and flamers having unusually high explosive ordnance for their tanks. For units that might use in the lore, they certainly go heavy on infantry tactics given their jungle fighting nature, and they tend to make great use of flamers and hellhounds to burn foes from the undergrowth. Mortars and indirect fire weapons are quite popular, as are snipers and scout sentinels to wade over rocky terrain. On the other hand, they're particularly famous not to get on too well with commissars, and draconian officers of the Scholar Progenium might be more likely to meet with an unfortunate accident if they happen to assert their will too forcefully on a Catachan regiment. For their unique units that are actually in the Codex, Guardsman Marbo is a usable enough infiltrating lone operative that occasionally might jump the enemy. Lone operatives do have some nice value all to themselves, although people tend to go for Gaunt's Ghosts as a first choice for guarding competitive currently. The Catachan Command Squad is maybe a little bit on the niche side, could be used to broadcast some orders from Lord Solar Leontus if you wanted to, or just make a fairly big fun Catachan Brawler Squad scouting into the mid-board and being a bit unusually fighty. The jungle fighters themselves are really quite good. Cheap frontline infantry with OC2 and Scout are pretty excellent. They're really good just to hold the centre objectives against all costs, and a couple of flamers can help them skirmish against their peers. They could pair quite well with a Chimera with a pair of heavy flamers to help them out with that role. And the heavy weapon teams get some nice fairly big hitting rerolls. Maybe las cannons just a tiny bit more viable on them compared with the other two variants. The mortars are still maybe most sensible just given how fragile they are. If you're using the Legends rules, then Iron Hand Strachan is a really fun unit as well, scouting up the board and then being able to use his rerolls to wipe out small squads of Space Marines and things like that. He's well capable of punching above his weight. In any case, if you want an army of muscly and practical jungle fighters burning the foe from the undergrowth, then the Catachans might be for you. Next up, and particularly well known for 10th edition, we've got the Death Corps of Krieg, a regiment of Guard with a pretty unique history, properly spelled out in the Imperial armour books as they were originally developed by Forge World. Their styling is sort of as World War I infantry, with a mix of themes of French and British despite a fairly German sounding name. Their homeworld of Krieg was an isolated world that suffered a great rebellion and insurrection against the Imperium, and they fought a grueling millennial-long civil war to ultimately crush the rebellion and make their planet remain loyal, as the consequences would probably have been quite bad otherwise, but to do so basically burnt the planet down, nuclear weapons turning much of their world to ash. This horrendous war basically instilled upon the remaining loyalists their ultimate duty to lay down their lives in service of the Emperor, and they have a great cult of sacrifice, near having no concept of how their own death could be bad, which does make them utterly fearless troops, but also not displaying any self-preservation, and commissars assigned to the Krieg might more often be tasked with making sure that they don't lay down their lives in unhelpful numbers and preserve their fighting power for when it actually makes sense. The soldiers are rumoured to be backgrown below the planet's surface, and basically always wear their iconic gas masks. When they make war, it's generally with siege regiments as the thing they're best known for. Infantry and cavalry charges supported by enormous pounding artillery barrages, though of course nothing beats an angry Kriegsman picking up an entrenching tool and laying about the enemy with a shovel. As I'm sure most Guard players will know, the Death Corps Krieg got a pretty awesome range refresh early in 2025. Loads of fun stuff, including probably my favourite one, the artillery team on the left here. A great big sandbagged gun emplacement manned by 3 troopers, a command squad led by a commissar and a few fun specialists. They have both a kill team kit and a regular infantry one, some heavy weapons with some fun options, including the dual heavy stubbers here and the heavy flamers. Their Death Riders are all very sinister, basically clawed biologically engineered steeds, wearing gas masks just the same as their owners, and they can be led by their named character in Lord Marshal Dreyer, fighting from the front line and has been in so many perilous situations and remained unscathed that people believe that he's immortal. The Krieg range did used to be really quite a lot bigger though. There's certain retired Forge World things out there that you might be able to find second hand or make proxies for, things like the Quartermaster Cadre, the Centaur, the Grenadier Squad, and plenty of others. I feel like Krieg has been one of the themes that quite a lot of 3D printing and third-party creators have made. Basically any futuristic infantry with gas masks look the part, so that's not exactly something Games Workshop have a unique right to. Here's just a couple of examples in the Maker's Cult Valakor or the Station Forge Grimguard. While we're on the subject of miniatures as well, they've had their big launch box in the not too distant past, certainly a box that tempted a whole bunch of people to jump into Krieg. With 10 cavalry, Dreyer, the artillery team and some combat engineers, these will gradually get sold out around the world eventually, though a fair few places still have stock. Out of channel affiliates and sponsors, Warhaus in Australia still has some at 23% discounts, and Element Games in the UK has them as well. I'll link them down in the video description if that could be helpful to anyone. Gameplay wise, the Krieg are one of the armies that absolutely have a very dedicated detachment choice. The Siege Regiment was the interesting one where it's mainly focused around infantry advances, but the special rules of it are sort of to represent pounding artillery barrages from off the board. You can do things like give your units stealth, expose the enemy with ignores cover, or potentially annoy melee units by slowing them down. I have a few things to allow platoon units to take up positions and hit a bit harder. Maybe some 20 strong squads of Kriegsmen getting some orders through the Voxes could be handy there. Generally it's playable enough if you want to go foot guard, though not really quite as standout strong as the Combined Regiment or the Hammer of the Emperor is at the moment. Then for their unique units, plenty of them are very good, but probably the most overshadowed are Marshal Dreyer and the Death Riders. I'm not entirely sure what Games Workshop was thinking with their initial points cost. Hopefully they'll get some points cuts in the not too distant future, but basically both of those cost far too much compared with their abilities right now. I'd probably run the Death Riders as Rough Riders in the interim personally. Their gear is basically the same. Their command squad I'd say is usable. You can broadcast orders with the Master Vox. You could pair with Leontus if you wanted to. The infantry squads are really quite a nice choice for things advancing into the midboard. With 20 of them you can regenerate either 2 to 4 of them on average when they've taken casualties, which is quite nice, and their damage buff and their special weapons as they take casualties is good too. Their heavy weapon teams are fairly solid. I've seen people play them with flamers a fair bit, a bunch of strength 5 and damage 2 attacks with ignores cover, and then you could potentially both overwatch and then also shoot on death with them as well, so you could really punish any enemy infantry trying to take the midboard. Combat engineers were maybe a bit more standouts, but Games Workshop nerfed the rules on their big mine for some reason. I'd say they're a little bit more on the niche side, but a cheap scout unit with some mortal wounds is still fun. And the artillery team I'd say is quite well balanced. It pays a premium for its damage being ignores line of sight, but a big strength 12 and damage 3 profile on that siege gun. That is some of the scariest ignores line of sight firepower that the Guard can muster right now. Overall though, they don't really tend to fare too badly on the tabletop, and if you want a regiment of unfeeling gas-masked siege experts, then the Death Corps of Krieg might be for you. Moving from Games Workshop's mainline plastic supported regiments to the ones that had the metal regiments that got phased out, next up we have the Mordian Iron Guard. They hail from the planet of Mordian, where they exist in this sort of twilight zone, given that there's one side of the planet in sun and one in perpetual night, and the society there is, or rather authoritarian, overcrowded, and occasionally that's led to treacherous mutiny against the Emperor. The Iron Guard stood utterly resolute though, resplendent in their fancy blue uniforms, and they're famed for fighting in fire formation, pretty much no matter the cost. Tightly packed squads of infantry marching around the battlefield in parade formation, somewhat rigid in their command structure, but utterly devastating when they open fire. The Mordians are one of the many Guard regiments that had at least a fairly well realised metal range in the past, with some infantry squads and heavy weapons and things, all very fancy dress uniforms with a bunch of medals and epaulets and things, lots of flat caps and finery, and then these, like many others, were eventually dropped by Games Workshop, meaning that if you want to collect an army with this sort of look and feel, you're either going to third-party creators, 3D printers, or trying to hunt down ancient metal models on eBay, usually for kind of ridiculous prices. Games Workshop have done a couple of made-to-order runs of the old Guard regiments, though I don't think they've done one for the Mordians to my memory, and they're so sporadic and unreliable that you wouldn't exactly wait for them. For their detachment choice, I feel like it's a bit less obvious than most. I guess for a famed fire discipline, something like Combined Regiment, giving you a direct damage buff and better orders seems at least fairly in keeping with that. Maybe Siege Regiment could also help out infantry a bit though. They can do all the normal guard regiment styles though, and play armoured or artillery regiments if you'd like. I think to realise them in a fluffy game at the moment, probably a bunch of ranked up infantry with Cadian or Death Corps Krieg datasheet rules led by some officers. That'd be a good mainstay, supported by some big guns of the guard. In any case, if you want an impeccably dressed and pre-drilled army with good fire discipline, the Mordians might be for you. Next up, we've got the Tallarn Desert Raiders, hailing from the vast desert world of Tallarn that was rendered that way in the Horus Heresy, and the hardy Imperials that have survived there since are famed desert warfare specialists, known for their mechanised warfare, tank formations, and absolutely blistering lightning-fast raids. Their homeworld is known to be the site of the single biggest tank battle in Warhammer 40K's history. Much of the inhabitants of Tallarn live below the ground, the only place to survive, and their infantry tend to have a focus on speed and stealth, generally trying to ambush the enemy and being happy fighting in dense sort of tunnel and enclosed terrain. Again, they had a solid metal range, lots of turbans and a general sort of Middle Eastern kind of vibe. They had infantry squads and heavy weapons, a few curved sabres in there, and they did have a unique character model in Captain Al-Rahim. I seem to remember his signature move in the past being a big flanking manoeuvre, having entire formations turn up on one side of the board. The same as the rest, that range has been retired now, though there's certainly some places that do kind of desert fighter style infantry. Victoria Miniatures is one I've certainly seen recommended before. I feel like their Desert Scorpion fighters really do the part justice. For detachment choice, I think it's kind of got to be the Hammer of the Emperor for Tallarn. They're famed for their tank regiments and their lightning-fast warfare, and that does both. The core rule meaning their vehicles can advance 6 inches, it's one command point for advance and shoot, so a very fast-moving and striking tank there. There's a stratagem to allow them to move through terrain, so they're not going to get pinned back quite as easily as other tank forces. Some really good enhancements for Rogel Dawn commanders, and some nice extra damage ones too. Leman Russes and Rogel Dawns tend to be some of the best damage dealers for the Astra Militarum currently. That works really well for them, and Cadian Catachan in Tauroxes are pretty strong there. Feels like that could be a good conversion project for some Tallarn elites if you wanted to. Otherwise, for themed units, they're also known to make good use of Rough Riders as well, so some cavalry forces to fight alongside the tanks might not be the worst idea, and you could convert some Yukali cavalry if you wanted, a 40k beastie native to their homeworld. For their combat doctrine, they tend to eschew static positions, dogging guns and fortifications where possible, so if you're going for a themed army, maybe a little bit less of the static gun artillery could be appropriate for the Tallarn. In any case, if you want an army of vaguely Middle Eastern themed desert warfare specialists famed for their lightning fast tank formations, the Tallarn might be for you. Next up, we've got the gas-masked forces of the Armageddon Steel Legion, hailing from the world that is their namesake, a vast industrial linchpin for the Imperium, considered far too pivotal to ever to allow to fall, which has set it as the scene for some absolutely cataclysmic conflicts in Warhammer 40k, invaded by the forces of Chaos and Angron in the First War of Armageddon, then twice more by Ghazghkull Thraka himself, and the defence marshalled by Commissar Yarrick, and now in most recent lore, Angron's back for another go, resisted by a coalition of Space Marines. Armageddon is what you generally imagine as an Imperial hive world, absolutely enormous hive cities with huge industrial capacity, and between then toxic wastes, much of the life eradicated on the planet by the ashes of industry, and like the Krieg, they also tend to wear rebreathers to allow them to survive out there in the hazardous environment. With Armageddon's vast industrial capacity, they're a very well supplied guard regiment, able to get good amounts of equipment when they need it, and in particular tend to be very well supplied by transports to get them around. They have a lot of mechanised regiments in their force, and the fighters themselves tend to be perhaps surprisingly savage as well. They make good use of recruitment from the vicious gangs from the Underhives, and many veterans of the Armageddon Steel Legion have had great conflicts against the Orcs in the past, and are expert Orc killers when they need to be. Miniatures wise, I believe their metal range was the last one to survive. Games Workshop removed a bunch of them and just kept them around, presumably as they were selling a bit better. Their theming is sort of late World War II or maybe early Cold War style infantry, with elements drawn from a bunch of different inspirations around the world. They're fitted with their rebreathers and goggles in a slightly different take to the Death Corps ones, and here in the centre we have Commissar Yarrick, of course, with his power claw taken from the downed Orc war boss, marshalling his men into battle, with his later life being consumed with the hunt for Ghazghkull Thraka. For detachment options, again they feel like they've got a really obvious one in the mechanised detachment for them. They're famed for fighting with their armoured fist squads, infantry units disembarking from chimeras or maybe Tauroxes, though they were a lesser thing when the Armageddon Steel Legion were a bit more central. The mechanised detachment is the one that gets you a +1 to wound when your units get out of transport and have a few fun tricks for mobility and jumping back into them. I regard it as a solidly usable one, but maybe again not one of the strongest, and really favours building into it quite heavily compared with some of the rest, but definitely a fun one that does actually have some interest. Generally a whole bunch of infantry squads in Chimeras will be a good place to start with them, backed up by plenty of fancy kits, big guns and some big tanks. They may be a little bit more known for using missile launchers compared with some regiments as well. Model wise, I feel like you could perhaps make them work with the current Death Corps models. They do give you a supply of gas mass miniatures to get to work with, and you could execute them in their colour scheme. In any case, if you want a force of industrial infantry fighting against the apocalyptic threats that assail the hives of Armageddon, then the Steel Legion might be the ones for you. Next up, from some ash deserts to snowbound tundra, we have the Valhallan Ice Warriors. These guys hail from the ice world of Valhalla, and they're incredibly hardy, famed for their uncompromising infantry assaults, human wave tactics of mass conscripts used to ground down the enemy, and they'll get the job done even if they pay a heavy cost in men. Their forces are often driven on mercilessly by feared commissars and brutal officers, and their infantry are winter warfare specialists, fighting in greatcoats and furred hats, having some World War II Soviet styling. For favoured foes, they're also well renowned for fighting the orcs, meeting the greenskins 1-for-1 in a brutal battle of attrition. Once again, their metal miniature range was retired, lots of greatcoats, fur hats, maybe some turbans and head wraps and things, and they did have a special character in Commander Chenkov, whose special rule was to send in the next wave, basically declare one wave of conscripts lost, and then send in a whole bunch more of them to overwhelm the foe. Again, probably best to look to 3D printers and third-party offerings for them. World War II style Soviets in space has definitely been done by a few makers out there, though again could maybe get at least some of the way with Kriegsman with a head swap maybe. It might not be quite the same, but might do enough to have the overall vibe. Fingers crossed Games Workshop might eventually get around to releasing a few more kits for the regiments. I feel like each of the guard regiments would make a pretty good kill team kit, and you wouldn't even necessarily need to go that much further with that if you gave them a bunch of interesting specialists and options. Detachment wise, I'd probably go for either the Combined Arms or Siege Regiments, maybe Combined Arms in particular for the reinforcement stratagem to allow a bit of that send in the next wave and unleash a whole new wave of bodies on the enemy. Otherwise, probably Siege Regiment is perhaps the best fit thematically, human wave tactics maybe backed up by some big guns at the back. That does seem kind of on point for them. Feels a bit of a shame that Games Workshop still don't really seem to have made Commissars a particularly strong choice worth taking, at least for their intended battlefield role. Would still be nice to include a couple of them for some more theme purposes though, maybe. In any case, if you want a grim determined army of great-goated guardsmen achieving victory with a grim demeanour and bloody sacrifice, the Valhallan Ice Warriors might be for you. Next up, we've got a different guard regiment in fancy hats, and these are the Vostroyan Firstborn. They're another planet that had a great rebellion against the Emperor, and as penance, their firstborn sons are now conscripted into the army, basically ceaselessly raising regiments of men to send out on crusade for the Imperium, their planet paying an eternal penance. The Vostroyan Firstborn generally tend to be pretty well equipped. They generally fight with weapons passed down for generations, man to man, and the artisan lasgun or special weapon that they carry might often be far more valuable than the guardsman who's holding it. They tend to be a little bit better armoured than average guard regiments as well, with a good supply of flak armour. I've seen some people liken their uniforms to sort of 17th century Russian streltsy. I can't say I know too much about that period of history, though it does look like it bears a good resemblance, just googling a few pictures of it. As mentioned, the Vostroyans were one of the later Metal Guard regiments to be added into the game, having some rather fun and big-hatted infantrymen, and a rather fancy-looking command squad as well. Feels like their aesthetic is maybe a little bit more of an unusual one, maybe a little bit lesser represented by third-party creators unless they're very deliberately trying to ape them. Their infantry tend to have really quite long-barreled lasguns with bayonets on the ends, and plenty of them have face masks with sort of lenses and rebreathers once again. For detachments and current rules, again I'd say it's a little bit less obvious. Maybe combined arms with their lethal hits could represent their finer weapons being deployed en masse on the board. For their units, they're generally tending to be better known for their infantry versus their tanks, with a lot of infantry elite troopers. Feels like it might be reasonable enough to get some elite miniatures and then use the Catachan or Scion datasheets to represent them on the board. That sort of feels like it fits the bill of better armour and better guns. If you want an all very fancy regiment, both equipped with fine gear but also paying an eternal penance, maybe the big-hatted Vostroyan Firstborn might be for you. Then finally, for the more major guard regiments, we've got the Militarum Tempestus, who in reality are basically a whole bunch of different regiments of their own distinct pattern, but these are the elite special forces of the Imperial Guard, highly elite stormtroopers, trained from birth by the Scholar Progenium. far more professional and dangerous compared with their drafted counterparts from the Astra Militarum's main arms, given the finest gear, sturdy carapace armour, and then dropped into the most dangerous situations imaginable, often on the back of a Valkyrie. They're incredibly resourceful soldiers, able to get the job done, and are well known for dropping in close to the enemy, blazing away with their boosted hotshot lasguns, and taking down enemy heavies with close-range special weapon fire such as Melter and Plasma. They do have a bunch of regiments in the lore that have their own special preferences and quirks. Miniatures-wise, as an army they often fight kind of as an allied force to the Astra Militarum. Their theming is often that you might just get individual squads of them supporting regiments, as there's just not enough of them to go around, but occasionally they are known to fight en masse. Their standard kit is the 5-man squad of Tempestus Scions. Their style is sort of a bit of a release of slightly technologically advanced special forces, but also with some kind of baroque stylings, with some gilded edges for their armour and the like, and their hotshot lasguns and volley guns generally tend to be plugged into big power packs on their backs. The Taurox has an alternate build as the Taurox Prime, getting a few fancy plates and different weapon options that mark it out as a Militarum Tempestus vehicle in that way. The regular Scion squad can be built as a command squad with a Tempestor leading them. We recently had the Tempestus Aquilons kill team dropping in on their backpack mounted grav shoots, and they have their fun little sentry turret model as well. And while the Valkyrie can be fielded by the rest of the guard regiments as well as an Aeronautica Imperialis asset, it's particularly well known for the Scions as one of their preferred ways of getting from A to B. For their detachments, the Scions do have their own unique theme one in the Bridgehead Strike. For a while that was the single most powerful guard detachment, with Scions ruling the roost there both before and after the Codex, though they did some balance updates basically toning it down a bit. It gives reroll 1s to hit to infantry, a +1 to hit for Scions dropping in or jumping out of transports, some damage dealer stratagems, and return to reserves for deep strike infantry. I'd say it's still usable if you want to field a themed force of Scions, and weirdly enough, it means artillery teams like the Siege Battery are pretty efficient there, but it's certainly no longer considered top dog for the guard. For their units, the Tempestus Scions are still pretty playable, solid enough as a damage combo when paired with a command squad. They can get a whole ton of stacking buffs between both datasheet rules and anything that the detachment that they're in might help out with. Or you can still use them as cheap deep strikers to do secondary objectives, though they are a little pricey for that role now. The Taurox Prime is maybe a touch on the niche side, though it can give you reroll hits to units stepping out of it, which is handy. The Valkyrie has a datasheet that's interesting enough, it's just rather unfortunately just crazily overcosted for what it does on the table. Games Workshop just basically don't want aircraft to be good in game in 10th edition, and the Aquilons basically pay a premium for their close range 6-inch deep strike. It could be worth having a squad of them for that utility, jumping on things that don't want to be hit first, or being in the right position to do certain secondaries, though I'll probably not go too heavy. You can still make a Scion heavy army pretty adequately scary though, particularly with multiple teams of them dropping in with command squads, and if you want to collect a guard regiment mainly themed around the Militarum Tempestus, perhaps these well-trained and highly equipped glory boys might be for you. Those are most of the guard that had big army sets all of their own. There's plenty of other guard regiments that have had some degree of miniature representation too. The Tanith First and Only starred in the Gaunt's Ghost novels, an infantry company with a big focus on stealth tactics, all very guerrilla warfare appropriate, and could be quite good for the recon element detachment if you wanted something lore appropriate. You can field Gaunt's Ghost themselves of course, they're a pretty cool HQ choice that can't be shot at long range, and returning to reserves every turn can allow all sorts of interesting stuff, particularly doing secondary objectives, but also a bit of fun chipping in with damage, and then maybe being able to jump on and bully some very light infantry units from time to time. The Tallarn Rough Riders are a famously cavalry-heavy regiment, and their shock assault cavalry are often seconded to other regiments, hailing from a feudal world of Attila. Now the Death Riders have a datasheet as well. You could field a very cavalry-heavy force if you wanted to, potentially 60 cavalry in a normal list if you did want to make a meme army for them. The detachments don't really tend to help out guard, melee or cavalry all that much unfortunately, though maybe recon element has a touch more than most, at least allowing them to be a bit more survivable. As a unit in themselves, the Attilan Rough Riders are pretty strong, nice melee damage for the points cost with those Frag or Melter Lances, and can be a really solid countercharge unit. Weirdly enough, the Guard Combat Patrol at the moment seems to be a mix between Attilans and Cadians. Finally, for main ones that I wanted to focus on, the Elysian Drop Troops are well deserving of a mention as one of the Forge World regiments that had a fairly solid model range at one point. They're a very airborne regiment from a civilized world beset by pirates and raiders, maybe some British military themes in them, and having quite a lot of special forces overlap with the Tempestus Scions these days. Their Forge World range has long been retired, and it feels like if you want to field an army with their sort of theming and aesthetic, I'd probably go with the Scions rules at the moment. It's a very big galaxy out there though, and every time there's a Guard Codex, Games Workshop often has a whole bunch of lore snippets for loads of minor regiments out there. The old school British Empire themed Praetorians were a thing once upon a time, some very showy red jackets and some white hats, and the Savlar Chem Dogs, and maybe another one that tends to be fairly well represented. A penal regiment made up of a whole bunch of cutthroat murderers doing anything to escape the toxic environment of their home planet. You can take one of those themes and the models around it and absolutely make your own theme with it too though. My Imperial Guard regiment is the 12th Orwell regiment, and basically going down vibes of the sort of military arm of the Thought Police from 1984. Fancy white armour and maybe a lot more used to being a police force and punching down at rebels fighting for freedom against their brutal regime, maybe standing against the enemies of the Emperor when they have to, but very much exemplifying the archetype that the Imperium isn't always the good guys. Let me know any of your custom guard regiments down in the comments. In any case though, I'll leave that one there for now. Hope you've enjoyed a talk through a whole bunch of guard regiments in Warhammer 40k. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more. I've made a fair few other guard videos on the channel, including a Start Collecting Astra Militarum one and a tier list. I'll link the tier list down below if you want to see something else to watch for the guard, so feel free to check that out next. A big thank you to Warhaus for sponsoring the video. As mentioned, feel free to check them out if you live down under and you'd like to get some Warhammer 40k things at a discount. Always good to get a good one in Australia given the crazy prices that Games Workshop charge down there. I'll leave this one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming with new ones out just about every day. If you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, then feel free to check out the Patreon page or any of the other discount affiliate links as well. They help to support the channel too. But in any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.